He lived a life that was as clean and sharp as the blueprints he drafted for a living. At 28, the man was an architect on a clear, upward path. His apartment, perched high above the city, was a testament to his personality, minimalist, orderly, and entirely under his control. Every piece of furniture had a purpose. Every surface was clear of clutter. The large windows didn't just let in light. They framed the city below as if it were a model he had built himself, a world that moved according to a plan he understood. His days were structured, his ambitions were clear, and his future was a series of neatly drawn lines leading to success. He was not a man who left room for messy, unplanned variables. Romance, for him, was a similar kind of design. He enjoyed the company of women, the laughter, the shared meals, the easy connection that didn't demand too much. It was all part of a well-balanced life. The young woman he had been seeing for the last few months fit perfectly into this design. She was kind, funny, and beautiful in a quiet way. They had a good time together, but their relationship was casual, built on spontaneous dinners and late-night conversations rather than any deep discussions about a shared future. He enjoyed her presence, but he never once penciled her into the long-term blueprint of his life. She was a pleasant detail, not a foundational beam. So, when she asked to meet him at a small, cozy coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, he thought nothing of it. He arrived a few minutes early, ordering his usual black coffee and finding a table in the corner. The shop smelled of roasted beans and sweet pastries, and the gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of ceramic mugs created a peaceful bubble. He watched her walk in, her movements a little hesitant. She was usually so bright and full of energy, but today a cloud seemed to hang over her. She sat down across from him, forcing a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They made small talk at first, but the words felt hollow and awkward. She kept wrapping her hands around her tea mug, her knuckles white. She wouldn't look at him directly, her gaze darting around the room as if she were looking for an escape route. He could feel a tension radiating from her, a nervous energy that was starting to make him feel uneasy. He leaned forward, his architect's mind trying to analyze the problem, to find the source of the structural fault in their usually easygoing dynamic. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. "You seem a little off." She took a deep, shaky breath as if preparing to dive into deep water. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, white plastic stick, placing it on the table between them. It took him a moment to recognize what it was. A pregnancy test. His mind went blank. For a second, he just stared at it, a simple, insignificant object that suddenly felt like it had the weight of a wrecking ball. Then he saw the two stark, pink lines. Positive. The word echoed in the sudden silence of his mind. Positive, the peaceful coffee shop. The smell of coffee, the sound of the city outside it, all faded away into a dull roar. There was only him, her, and the tiny plastic stick delivering a verdict that would demolish the carefully constructed world he had built. His first instinct was not sadness or anger, but a cold, sharp, and overwhelming sense of denial. It felt like a mistake, a glitch in the matrix. His brain, the brain that was trained to solve complex puzzles and find logical solutions, started firing off questions and calculations. He ran through the timeline of their relationship, the sporadic nature of their encounters. It didn't add up. It couldn't be right. He looked up from the test, his eyes finding hers. He saw a flicker of hope in her expression, a desperate plea for him to say the right thing, to be the man she hoped he was. But panic had already taken the wheel. "Are you sure it's mine?" The words left his mouth before he could stop them. They sounded cruel, accusatory, and cold even to his own ears. He saw the hope in her eyes instantly extinguish, replaced by a deep, wounded shock. But he couldn't take it back. The fear was a tidal wave, and he was just trying to keep his head above water. He started talking, his voice gaining a false confidence as he built a wall of logic around himself. "We weren't always. This seems unlikely. Are you absolutely certain? Have you considered other possibilities?" He wasn't asking questions. He was making statements. Each one a brick in the fortress he was desperately trying to build to protect the life he knew. He watched her as he spoke. Her shoulders slumped, and she pulled her hands back from the table, folding them in her lap as if to protect herself. The color drained from her face. She had come to him with a vulnerable, terrifying truth, and he had met her not with comfort, but with a cross-examination. He was no longer the man she had laughed with. He was a stranger, cold and calculating. He was trying to solve a problem, and in that moment, she was the problem. He told her he was shocked, that he needed time to process it. He said he had to go. He stood up, throwing some crumpled bills on the table, not even looking to see if it was enough to cover the check. He couldn't bear to look at her face, to see the damage he had just done. He walked out of the coffee shop, the little bell above the door jingling merrily, a sound that felt like a mockery of the heavy silence that now hung between them. He stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, but he felt no warmth. He had escaped the immediate confrontation, the terrifying reality in that small white box. But as he began to walk away, he knew he wasn't free. He had just made a choice. He had chosen the certainty of his empty, orderly apartment over the terrifying, messy possibility of a family. He had chosen his blueprint over a baby. And as he walked, a strange, hollow feeling began to grow in his chest, the first crack in the foundation of the perfect life he was so determined to protect. The days that followed the meeting in the coffee shop blurred into a frantic rhythm. The man threw himself into his work with a feverish intensity he hadn't known he possessed. His office became his fortress, a place of straight lines, precise measurements, and predictable outcomes. He was designing a new public library, a project he loved. He spent hours hunched over his drafting table, the sharp scratch of his pencil on vellum the only sound that could quiet the noise in his head. He focused on the angle of the sun hitting the reading nooks, the flow of people through the main hall, the structural integrity of the soaring glass atrium. These were problems he could solve. These were variables he could control. He worked late, long after his colleagues had gone home, the city lights twinkling below him like a distant, irrelevant galaxy. He told himself this was dedication, this was ambition. In reality, it was escape. When he wasn't working, he was trying to live the life he thought he should be living. He accepted every invitation, every after-work drink, every weekend gathering. He became the life of the party, telling loud stories and laughing a little too hard. He was performing, playing the role of the carefree, successful bachelor. His friends bought it, mostly. They'd slap him on the back and comment on how great he was doing. But sometimes a buddy from college would ask, "Hey, whatever happened to that girl you were seeing? The quiet one with the nice smile?" The question would hit him like a physical blow, and he'd force a shrug. "Oh, it wasn't really going anywhere. We're just busy, I guess." He'd quickly change the subject, his heart thumping a panicked beat against his ribs, and hope they wouldn't see the lie in his eyes. The silence from the young woman was the heaviest thing he had ever carried. At first, it was a relief. No more difficult conversations, no more reminders of the path his life was threatening to take. But as the days turned into a week, then two, the silence began to change. It was no longer an absence. It was a presence. It filled the quiet corners of his pristine apartment. It echoed in the passenger seat of his car where she used to sit. It was there when he cooked a meal for one, the extra portion he used to make sitting untouched in the refrigerator until he had to throw it away. The silence was a constant, low-frequency hum of accusation. He started seeing babies everywhere. It was like they had been hidden from him before, and now his eyes were tuned to their frequency. He'd see a father struggling to fold a stroller on the subway, and instead of feeling annoyance at the delay, he'd feel a strange, foreign pull. He'd watch the man's gentle, frustrated movements, the way he'd talk softly to the small, bundled-up child, and a hollow ache would open up in his chest. He couldn't name the feeling. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It wasn't regret, not yet. It was more like a recognition of a world he had shut himself out of, a world of messy, complicated, profound love that operated on a completely different set of blueprints than his own. One afternoon, walking through a park to get to a meeting, he saw a young mother sitting on a bench, her baby in a carrier on her chest. The baby was awake, its tiny hand resting on the mother's collarbone, its fingers no bigger than matchsticks. The mother was looking down at the baby, her expression soft and full of a wonder so pure it made the man's throat tighten. He had to stop and turn away, a wave of something so powerful it felt like grief washing over him. He leaned against a tree, his briefcase feeling suddenly heavy in his hand. He had built a wall of logic and reason to protect himself, but moments like this were like water, seeping through the cracks and threatening to bring the whole structure down. He tried to fight it. He told himself he had done the right thing. A baby born into a casual relationship, a baby he wasn't ready for, a baby he had denied. It would have been a disaster for everyone. It was the responsible choice, the logical choice. He repeated this to himself like a mantra, especially at night when the city was quiet and his own thoughts were the loudest noise in his apartment. He would walk around the perfect, orderly space, running his hand over the smooth, uncluttered surfaces. This was his life. This was what he had worked for. This was success, but the words began to lose their meaning. The denial that had once felt like a strong, protective shield was starting to feel like a cage. He was trapped inside his own life, a life that suddenly felt empty and meaningless. The sharp angles of his furniture felt cold and unwelcoming. The view of the city no longer looked like a model he had mastered. It looked like a vast, lonely sea of lights, with him adrift in his high-rise apartment, completely alone. The silence from her was no longer a relief. It was a verdict. It was the quiet, steady sound of his own mistake, growing louder every single day. He was fighting a battle, and he was beginning to realize he was on the wrong side. The abstract idea of a baby was slowly, painfully, transforming into a person, a life he was willfully ignoring. And the weight of that ignorance was becoming too heavy to bear. The call came on a Tuesday evening, a day that felt like any other. He had just gotten home from work, his tie loosened and his briefcase dropped by the door with a familiar thud. The city hummed its nightly song outside his window, a sound he usually found comforting. He was in the kitchen pouring a glass of water when his phone rang. The number wasn't one he recognized, and for a moment he considered letting it go to voicemail. But something, a nagging instinct he couldn't ignore, made him swipe the screen. Hello? The voice on the other end was female, but it wasn't the woman he had been avoiding. It was older, tighter, and laced with a cold, sharp anger. It's her sister, the voice said, not bothering with a greeting. She's in labor. They took her to the hospital about an hour ago. She wanted you to know. The words hit him like a physical force, knocking the air from his lungs. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the hardwood floor, but he didn't even hear the crash. All he could hear was the roaring in his own ears. Labor. It was happening. Now. The sister didn't wait for a reply. City General? Do what you want with that information. And then the line went dead. He stood frozen in his kitchen, shards of glass at his feet, water pooling around his shoes. For 2 hours he was a man possessed by a storm of panic and a strange magnetic pull he couldn't explain. He paced his apartment like a caged animal, from the living room window to the kitchen counter and back again. His mind was a battlefield. One voice, the voice of fear and logic, screamed at him to stay put. This was a trap. It was a complication. It was not his problem. He had made his choice. He could just delete the number, block the sister's contact, and pretend this call never happened. He could go on with his life, his neat, orderly, empty life. But another voice, quieter and more persistent, whispered from a place deep inside him, a place he didn't know existed. It wasn't a voice of reason. It was a primal, undeniable urge. Go. It was the same instinct that makes a bird return to its nest. A pull toward something he didn't understand, but knew he couldn't ignore. He fought with himself, his thoughts a chaotic tangle. He saw his career, his freedom, his carefully constructed future flashing before his eyes, all of it threatened by this single, terrifying event. But then, another image would push its way through, the woman's face in the coffee shop, the hope in her eyes turning to ash. He saw the silence that had followed him for weeks, a silence that now felt like a scream. He looked around his perfect apartment, at the clean surfaces and the expensive furniture, and for the first time, it all looked like a stage set for a play about a man who didn't really exist. The life he was so desperately trying to protect felt hollow, a shell with nothing inside it. The pull grew stronger, drowning out the fear. He had to go. He didn't know why, he didn't know what he would say, he didn't know what would happen next. But he knew he had to see it for himself. He grabbed his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the door open. The drive to the hospital was a blur. The city lights streaked past his windows like smears of paint. He ran a red light, the blast of a car horn barely registering. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, and his throat was dry as sandpaper. He felt like he was driving to his own execution, or perhaps to his own birth. He had no plan, no script. He was just a man being pulled by an invisible thread toward a moment that would either break him or remake him. The hospital was a world unto itself, a place of sterile white walls, sharp antiseptic smells, and a symphony of beeping machines and hushed, hurried footsteps. The automatic doors swooshed open, and the cool, processed air hit him like a slap. He felt like an imposter, a fraud walking into a place of real pain and real miracles. He approached the reception desk, his voice barely a whisper when he asked for her room number. The nurse gave him a sympathetic but tired look and pointed him down a long, echoing corridor. The elevator ride to the maternity ward felt like the longest ascent of his life. Each floor number dinging like a countdown to his new reality, he found the room number and stood outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle, a coward on the verge of a life-altering decision. Through the small square window in the door, he could see a dimly lit room. He could see the shape of a bed and someone in it. He could hear a faint, rhythmic beeping sound. This was it. The point of no return. He could still turn around, walk away, and get back in his car. He could go back to his empty apartment and try to forget. But he knew he couldn't. The invisible thread had pulled him all the way here, and it would not let him go. Taking a deep, shaky breath that felt like inhaling glass, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was quiet, save for the soft beep of a monitor and the gentle hum of a warmer in the corner. She was in the bed, propped up against a stack of pillows. She looked exhausted, her face pale and her hair damp with sweat, but her eyes were clear and fixed on him. There was no anger in her gaze, no accusation. There was only a deep, unwavering resolve. In her arms, wrapped in a soft pink blanket, was a tiny baby. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him, and then her eyes drifted down to the bundle in her arms. He felt his throat go completely dry. He moved closer, his feet feeling heavy as lead, his eyes drawn to the small, scrunched-up face peeking out from the blanket. It was a baby. A real, live, tiny human. It had a little button nose and a smattering of dark hair. And then its eyes opened. They were drowsy and unfocused at first, but then they seemed to land right on him. And he saw them. The baby's eyes were the exact same shade of deep, startling hazel as his own, with the same small, distinct flecks of gold near the pupil that he had seen in his own reflection 1,000 times. In that single, undeniable glance, every argument, every piece of doubt, and every wall he had spent months building crumbled into dust. It was an instant, biological recognition that bypassed his brain and struck his soul with the force of a lightning bolt. It was a connection so pure and so absolute that it silenced the entire world. The beeping machines, the hospital smells, the fear in his heart, it all vanished. There was only him and this tiny, perfect stranger who was, in every possible way, his. The world in the hospital room went silent. It wasn't a quiet that came from a lack of sound. The monitor was still beeping its soft, steady rhythm, and the faint sounds of the ward could be heard from the hallway. It was an internal silence, a complete shutdown of all the noise in his own head. The fear, the logic, the panicked calculations, the carefully constructed walls of denial, all of it vanished. There was only the profound, earth-shattering recognition in those tiny, hazel eyes. It was like looking into a mirror that showed not his present self, but his beginning, his origin, his own blood staring back at him. A current of electricity, pure and undeniable, shot through him, starting in his chest and spreading to the tips of his fingers and toes. The air left his lungs in a whoosh, and for a terrifying second he thought he might collapse. He had to reach out and steady himself on the edge of the bed, his knuckles white, tears welled in his eyes, hot and sudden. He wasn't a man who cried. He couldn't remember the last time he had. But now, the tears streamed down his face, silent and unstoppable. They weren't tears of sadness or even of joy, but of pure, overwhelming awe. It was a feeling so immense it felt like it might break him apart. Every part of his life that had come before this moment, the promotions, the clean apartment, the casual dates, the carefully laid plans, seemed like a silly, childish game. All of it was nothing. This was real. This tiny, breathing, blinking person in a pink blanket was the only thing that had ever been real. He looked from the baby's eyes to the mother's face. She was watching him, her expression unreadable, a mixture of exhaustion and caution. She had seen his denial, his cruelty. She was waiting to see what he would do now, in the face of this undeniable truth. His throat was thick with emotion, and when he finally found his voice, it was a cracked, broken whisper. Can I hold her?" The words felt inadequate, a pathetic request for a connection he had no right to ask for. He braced himself for a no. He deserved a no. He had run away from this responsibility, had questioned her integrity, had chosen his own selfish comfort over her and the baby's well-being. He was a stranger to her now, a man who had caused her immense pain. He had no right to touch this perfect, innocent child. The young woman studied his face. Her eyes searched his, looking for any sign of the man who had left her in that coffee shop. She looked for the fear, the selfishness, the cold logic, but she didn't see it. All she saw was a man utterly humbled, his face wet with tears, his expression a raw, open wound of regret and wonder. He looked like a man who had just seen a miracle, and in a way he had. She saw the way his hands trembled, the way his entire body was leaning toward the baby, as if pulled by an invisible force. She saw a complete and total transformation happening in real time. After a long, tense moment that stretched for an eternity, she gave a slow, cautious nod. It was the most gracious act of forgiveness he had ever known. She shifted in the bed, her movements stiff with tiredness, and gently began to unwrap the blanket just a little, creating a space for him. "Support her head," she instructed softly, her voice raspy. "She's still a bit wobbly." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He leaned in, his arms feeling clumsy and huge, like he was trying to thread a needle with boxing gloves on. She carefully transferred the tiny bundle into his arms. The moment the baby's weight settled against his chest, something fundamental and seismic shifted inside him. She was so light, yet she felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. She was warm and smelled of something new and clean, a scent he couldn't place but knew he would never forget. He looked down at his daughter and the world tilted on its axis again. Her tiny face was scrunched up, her little mouth forming a perfect O shape before settling into a sleepy pout. He saw the dark, wispy hair on her head and the incredibly long eyelashes that rested against her cheeks. And then one of her tiny hands, no bigger than a strawberry, escaped the blanket and curled around his thumb. The feeling of her small, warm fingers gripping him, a reflexive act of complete trust, sent a bolt of fierce, protective love so powerful through him that it almost brought him to his knees. This was it. This was the feeling he had been running from, the feeling that had the power to demolish a life and build a new one in its place. He was no longer just an architect, a man with a plan. He was a father. The word echoed in his soul, filling up all the empty spaces he never knew he had. He gently swayed back and forth, a movement that felt as natural as breathing. He looked at the young woman in the bed, his eyes filled with a regret so profound it was an apology in itself. "I'm so sorry," he said, the words thick with emotion. "I was so scared. I was a coward. I didn't know. I had no idea." He couldn't explain the depth of his mistake, the foolishness of his denial, but he hoped she could see it in his face. He hoped she could see that the man who had walked away from her in that coffee shop was gone. Replaced by this man, this father, holding their child. She watched him, a single tear tracing a path down her own cheek. She didn't say anything, but her posture softened. The hard, defensive line of her shoulders relaxed, and she let out a long, slow breath, as if she had been holding it for months. He looked back down at the baby who had fallen asleep in his arms, her tiny grip on his thumb loosening slightly. He knew this wasn't a magic fix. He knew he had a long way to go to earn her trust, to be a real father to this little girl. But he also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would spend the rest of his life trying. "I'm here now," he said, his voice stronger now, filled with a quiet resolve. "I'm not going anywhere." And in the quiet of that hospital room, as he held his daughter for the first time, it wasn't just a promise. It was a new blueprint for his life. He didn't become a perfect father overnight, but he became a present one. The first few days were a blur of learning, a crash course in a life he had never studied for. The hospital, with its helpful nurses and sterile environment, had been a safe bubble. The moment they brought the baby home, the reality of it all crashed down on him. His pristine, orderly apartment was suddenly invaded. A bassinet took up half the living room floor. A diaper-changing station was perched precariously on his expensive coffee table. The clean, minimalist scent of his home was replaced by the warm, milky, sometimes messy smell of a new baby. It was chaos and it was beautiful. His first real test came just an hour after they got home. The baby started to cry. It wasn't a soft whimper. It was a loud, demanding, earth-shattering wail that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The young mother, exhausted and emotional, looked at him with panic in her eyes. He felt his own fear rise up, that old familiar panic. But this time it was different. It wasn't fear for himself. It was fear for her. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know what's wrong." She guided him through it, her voice tired but patient. "Check her diaper. Is she hungry? Maybe she just needs to be held." He fumbled with the tiny tabs on the diaper, his fingers feeling like giant, clumsy sausages. He got it wrong twice before finally getting it right. He warmed a bottle, his hands shaking so much he almost spilled the formula everywhere. But he didn't give up. He kept trying, moving from one task to the next, driven by a single, powerful goal: to stop her tears. That first night was the longest of his life. The baby cried on and off, and he was up with her every time. He learned the difference between a hungry cry and a tired cry. He learned how to walk the endless circles around his living room, patting her back and murmuring nonsense words in a low, soothing voice. At 3 a.m, slumped in a chair with the baby finally asleep on his chest, he looked around his apartment. It was a mess. There were baby wipes on the floor, a half-empty bottle on the counter, and his own life was in complete disarray. But as he looked down at the tiny, peaceful face resting on him, he felt a sense of accomplishment he had never felt from finishing a building design. He had survived the first night. He had been a father. He and the young woman didn't magically fall back in love. The hurt he had caused was still there, a quiet, lingering shadow between them. But they built something new, something perhaps stronger, a partnership. They were a team, united by their shared love for this tiny, helpless human. He learned to read her cues, to know when she was too tired to even speak, and he would take the baby without a word, letting her sleep. He would go to the grocery store, a list of strange new items in his hand diapers, formula, special detergent for baby clothes, and feel a strange sense of pride. He was no longer just providing for himself. He was providing for them. He started cooking simple meals, not just for one, but for 3, leaving a plate for her in the refrigerator for when she woke up. These small, quiet acts of service were his apologies, his promises being kept one day at a time. His social life changed completely. His friends stopped calling as much, and the invitations to bars and parties dwindled. At first, it stung. He felt a pang of jealousy when he saw pictures online of his old life, the carefree laughter and late nights. But then the baby would grip his finger, or give a sleepy, gummy smile, and the feeling would vanish, replaced by a warmth that no night out with friends could ever provide. He was trading one kind of happiness for another, a fleeting, superficial kind for a deep, lasting one. He was no longer the man who was trying to prove something to the world. He was a man who had found his purpose. A few months later, he was often seen in his neighborhood, not heading to a fancy restaurant or a bar, but pushing a stroller. He would walk slowly, pointing out the dogs, the trees, the noisy buses to the little girl who was now more alert and curious. He would stop at the park and sit on a bench, unbuckling her from the stroller and holding her on his lap so she could see the world. He would talk to her, not in baby talk, but as if she could understand everything, telling her about the buildings he designed, about the clouds in the sky, about how much he loved her. Other parents would smile at him in that knowing, tired but happy way that parents have. He was now part of their club, a member of a secret society bound by sleepless nights and overwhelming love. One sunny afternoon, he was sitting on that same park bench. The baby was in his arms, awake and content. She was getting bigger, her personality starting to shine through. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him. And there they were, those same eyes, the deep, startling hazel with the flecks of gold. When he had first seen them in the hospital, they had been a shock, a verdict that had shattered his world. Now, looking into them was like coming home. In them, he saw his past mistakes, a reminder of the man he used to be and the cowardly choice he had almost made. He saw his present purpose, the reason he got up every morning, the center of his new, chaotic, wonderful world. And he saw his entire future, a future he couldn't plan or draw on a blueprint, a future that was uncertain and messy and more exciting than anything he had ever imagined. He had denied her at first, but now, as he gently kissed her soft forehead, he knew he would spend the rest of his life making up for lost time, one precious, unforgettable moment at a time.